Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Heather, all the way from Australia. So we're delighted that you can make it here this evening, virtually, of course, but I know we've got a real treat in store talking to you. So thank you ever so much for joining us. We're delighted so many of you could join us this evening to talk about Heather's latest book, Stories of Hope. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. If you'd like to do this through the Q&A or the chat button on your computers, then Fiona, who will be introducing Heather, will be able to take these questions. So please may I introduce Fiona Shaw, who's a friend of the Bookshop and an avid reader. Delighted that she can be here to interview you, Heather, this evening. So a very big welcome, Heather, and I'll hand you over to Fiona now, okay, to continue.
Thank you so much.
Hello, Heather. It's an absolute privilege to speak to you. I'm so glad to be here this evening with you. And
thank you. You've been having some technical difficulties, I guess.
Yes. Luckily, I live very nearby, so I've actually suddenly had to come down to the shop itself. But that aside, it must be very early in the morning for you.
It's about 5:30. Yes.
Oh my word. Well, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
I've read all three of your books and enjoyed them all enormously. The most recent one, this one, is so inextricably bound up with the other two that I would like to start there, if I may.
Absolutely.
Your first book, a huge success, The Tattooist of Auschwitz, and I'm sure most people who are with us this evening will already have read it, and if not, they should get down to the shop and buy a copy straight away. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to write that book?
Oh, absolutely. And maybe, Fiona, can I just throw it out there that one of the better ways I find that talking with people, particularly on these Zoom meetings, is anyone who's got a question, I'm happy to take it right away, virtually, to have your questions dictate how we go ahead and chat from here on.
Thank you.
You probably come and spent some time thinking, oh, I'd really like to know this, and you'd like the opportunity to ask the question, and then I go and barrel on and answer the thing and don't give you your chance. So
I could take up the whole evening myself, but I'm not going to.
Well, any questions that come through, please feel free to say who it's from so I can acknowledge them, and let's run with it and just see how it flows from here on. Thank you. Yes, Lali Sokolov, the tattooist of Auschwitz, or the Tattavera. He used that word all the time. In fact, it was one of the first words he said to me was, "Did you know I was the Tattavera?" And I had to say no, because actually, well, didn't know what a Tattavera was, so how could I know that you were it? But I met him because after many months of saying no to catching up with a friend, I lived quite away from, well, I thought it was quite away from where she did, having a coffee with her one Sunday afternoon. Now listen, guys, this is back in December 2003, the 3rd of December to be precise. And she just casually said to me, oh, by the way, I have a friend whose mother's just died. His father has asked him to find somebody he can tell a story to. That person can't be Jewish. You're not Jewish. Do you want to meet him? And it was as simple as that, a passing comment. When I asked what his story was, and she didn't know, and I said, oh, never mind. Yes, I'd like to meet him. And a week later, I knocked on the apartment door of Lali Sokolov and began the most amazing 3 years of my life with that gentleman, and becoming now intrinsically wound up in his story, his life, which is now...
You spent 3 years talking to him. I know that you say you don't make notes, so talk to us about how you got the story down.
Yeah, well, those 3 years, by the way, they weren't just talking to him about his story. That was sort of really wrapped up in, I suppose, under 12 months, but it did take that time. But he became my friend, so we were just friends until literally the day he died. And I was with him a couple of hours before he did die, knowing he wasn't going to see the sun come up the next day. And the reason I'm here now, all these years later, the last thing I said to him when I kissed him goodbye was that I will never, ever stop trying to tell your story. It was, to me, well, the fact that this man, this beautiful old man, had entrusted me to tell his story. I had to find a way. But yeah, look, I worked in a hospital in the social work department. I knew, particularly when dealing with people who were well, in the hospital, they were only talking to me because something tragic or traumatic was going on in their lives. And the only way people would actually talk to you was that if you just sat and listened. If you were scribbling down notes, they would get distracted and they just didn't engage with you. So I already knew that. And Luddy was no exception. Even though he wasn't a patient in a hospital, he was a grieving man. He just lost the love of his life. And he didn't want to be with me. He wanted to be with her. So yes, I would sit there and just listen to him. And I even thought a recorder between the two of us will be a distraction. And but here's the thing, isn't it? When you do sit and listen, you actually hear. You hear what's being said.
There's a difference, isn't there, between listening? It's active listening that you have to do. Do you think it was because your friend knew that you were used to dealing with traumatized people that you would be the person to talk to him, or did she not even know what he was going to tell you about?
Look, there was an element of that. She admitted to me several years later that Unpacked wasn't the first person she'd asked, but the other person, her friend she had who wasn't Jewish, had said, no, not really. No, I don't have time. So I kind of got the gig by default. But still, I had to win over Lully, didn't I? I still had to get his trust.
Absolutely. And so you are actively listening to this man telling you really very, very difficult things. That must have impacted on you quite a lot.
Well, yes, it did, but it shouldn't have. I should have known better, because one of the things you have when you're training, working in the environment I was, that you know that you can only help someone who needs your help, even if they don't. You can't be a help to somebody if you become emotionally attached to them. Well, that was very, very hard with Lully because I was spending so much time with him. And I didn't appreciate it initially until my family got to know him quite well too. And I would come home from seeing him and they would say to me, how's Lully? Everybody would dance around wanting to know how he was. And I didn't appreciate that I switched from telling them what a lovely time I had with him to just saying he's fine and not engaging any further. And there was a colleague of mine at work one day who overheard me talking to him and me saying to her, oh, I don't think I can see him. I'm just absolutely wiped and drained. She kind of smacked me around and said, oh, for goodness sake, she said, classic case of transference. Now get over it. And she reminded me that I had no right to think I could own any part of his pain or his trauma or his guilt. It just wasn't mine. And to find a strategy to not take on that ownership, even though he was what we would say in Australian football, handballing it to me in spades, and I could see it leaving him. He was changing physically and emotionally.
Why do you think it was that he left it until after Gita, his wife, had died to want to tell the story?
Oh, that was really simple, very clear, because Gita wouldn't let him talk about it. To her, that was a closed chapter of their lives, and she didn't talk about it, and not even to their own sort of son. And I met many other friends of theirs, because Lully ended up taking me out, and I became his, quote, girlfriend, and would accompany him on many, many social occasions and meet all these amazing, well, men and women, but it was the women, the survivors, that I then gravitated to, because from them I could find out what it was like for the girls and Gita in the camp. And yeah, through meeting them, I also learned that Gita didn't talk amongst the other women very much either.
Oh,
when
right.
they did.
It's quite common, I think, isn't it, for survivors? You've now met many, I know, for survivors not to talk to their family.
That's more the norm. Yes.
And that we're now finding that because obviously there are fewer and fewer of these people to talk now, that as people are clearing lofts and sorting out their parents' and grandparents' affairs, they're finding out these extraordinary stories.
And that's partly why the book came about too. The number of people, it's multifaceted why that book came about. I'm talking about stories of hope here, not the tattooist. The number of people who have approached me, spoken to me at events, or written to me saying, I deeply regret that I did not speak to my family member, my grandmother, my mother, my father, when I was still alive, to learn their story. And I'm not just talking about the Holocaust, by the way. I'm talking about just getting to know they're older, better. You know, your parents bring you up. You think you know them. Heads up, guys, you don't. Not unless you make time to actually talk to them as an adult.
So you say, I know you've said, let's go back again. We'll jump forward to your current book, but let's just go back again, because from your stories, you're speaking with Lally. In fact, actually, before I move on to what I was going to say, there's a wonderful thing you say about you wrote it originally as a screenplay, not as a novel.
Yep.
And I wonder if you'd share with us the wonderful story about Lally choosing who should play him in the film.
Oh, thank you. You know, every time I knocked on his door, and as I say, I would be seeing him sometimes 2 to 3 times a week, he always greeted with me with, "Have you finished my book yet?" And I would immediately respond, "No, Lally, and it's not a book, it's a screenplay." And for nearly a year, that comment just went, you know, straight through to the wicket keeper, as we would say. And then one day he kind of pulled me up and he went, "Well, what are you talking about? What's a screenplay?" I said, "Lally, I want your book to be made into a film. That's how I see your story." And he got really excited and he's looked at me, "A movie? You want to make a movie about me?" And I went, "Yeah, honey, I do. That's what I'd like. And that's why I've written it as a screenplay." He goes, "Well, who will play me?" And I went, "I don't know. Look, we're not there yet." And he thought for all of about 5 seconds before saying, "Brad Pitt. You get me Brad Pitt. He's a good-looking boy and I'm a good-looking boy." Well, I pointed out that Brad was too old. And we then had to go to every new release movie for months because he wanted to find the perfect person to play Lally Sokolov. That's kind of how he spoke, by the way. He referred to himself in the third person. So yeah, movie after movie, he's rejecting all these amazing potential actors until finally, you know, one day I take him to a movie to see one particular actor. He immediately looks at me when he comes on the screen, rolls his eyes. It was dark, but I know he rolled his eyes. He used to do that a lot. And I said, "What are you thinking?" But 10 minutes later, there was another actor on the screen and Lally was on his feet. "That's me. He should be me." He's screaming out in the theatre. New release movie, theatre's full. I put him down, but he gets back up. "You down the front, turn around and look at me. Don't you think he looks like me?" So we had this hilarious time, and finally people in the theatre started slow clapping. Well, I knew it was to shut him up, but he took that as a sign of, "See, they agree with me." So Lally had found the person to play him, the American actor Ryan Gosling.
He's obviously such a character, and I know that you welcomed him into your family, and he became obviously a very personal friend, and you spent a long time working on this project. Is it going to become a film?
It's in development to be a 6-part miniseries.
Oh,
so yes, we're going with the small screen, not the big screen.
So when can we look forward to seeing that?
Whenever this pandemic gets out of our way and enables the production company to get on with it.
Right.
So I can't answer that now because yes, we're all in a state of hold.
I'm interested in 2 more things that you've mentioned already. One was that he was very keen that you should not be Jewish. He wanted whoever wrote his story not to be Jewish. Can you talk to us a bit about that? Why you think that was?
The very first day I met him, that was really clear, because to him he said, "There's not a Jewish person alive who can't be touched by the Holocaust. They will have their own story and their own family background. How can they tell mine when they've got their own?" And so yes, it was incredibly important to him. And oh, I was so embarrassed to have to admit to him how little I did know about the Holocaust. Now, my small town education in New Zealand had taught me so little. And that was very humbling to have to admit that. But his eyes lit up and he went, "Good, good. You will hear my story."
And how have other survivors reacted to your stories?
Brilliantly. In fact, they all want me to tell theirs. Even before the book was written, even when I was meeting his friends and the people, you know, Australia got, I think, the 2nd largest number of Holocaust survivors outside of Israel. So there were literally thousands and thousands of Holocaust survivors made their way here. And I got to meet many of them, hundreds, I would say. And yeah, look, even way back in the beginning when I was with Lally, they would say, "When you finish Lally's story, you tell mine. This is what happened to me." And that continues even to this day. And if it's not the Holocaust survivor themselves, it's their family members who struggle, as I've said, often to get their family member to talk to them. And I find myself suggesting that, why don't you try doing the same thing Lally did? Find a stranger, somebody that your family member is not emotionally connected to. And just maybe, don't force them.
Let's move on to Silke's Journey, which was your second book, which grew out of the first book. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that project?
Oh, look, there was no question, but publishers pending, that I would attempt to write Silke's story, because Lally made me promise that I would. The first time he mentioned her, which was probably many months after I met him, because anything that was really, really painful to him, well, he hung on to that. He sometimes gave me a snippet and then he would shut down. But the day he did finally say to me, "Did I tell you about Silke?" And I went, "No, who was she?" He got distressed, put his head down, and he would shake his head and he'd go, "You and I would not be here if it wasn't for Silke. She was the bravest person I ever knew and she saved my life. And when you finish telling my story," and then he'd wag his finger and smile at me, "only after you've told my story, you tell the world about Silke. And you just excuse me, I do need to wipe my nose. It is spring here in Melbourne and it is hay fever season for me. So no, I do not have COVID-19, I have hay fever."
We all wish we were in Australia, to be honest. So.
I'm in lockdown, I'm in curfew. I'm not sure you want to be where I am. I'd like to be in Australia still, but in one of the other states.
Anyway, I can see your book, Silke's Story, behind you, I think. So carry on speaking about her.
Yeah, so look, for me, it was always meant to be, I need to tell this story. But it was very different, of course, because I didn't have her. But I knew from Lally that she had this time in Auschwitz, and then she'd then been taken to Siberia and spent time in a gulag, because Lally's wife, Gita, had kept in touch with Silke and had visited her back in Slovakia. I knew she'd survived. I knew she'd had a happy family, a happy life with a husband, a man she met in the gulag. Yeah, just like Lady and Gita found love in the prison camp. So I knew that enough about it. And when we had researchers researching Lally's story, even when he was alive, and we were doing it here in Melbourne, and I kind of sent a quiet email to them. They were in Europe, professional researchers. And I said, "Oh, listen, by the way, can you just have a look at this name for me too and see what you can find for me?" And so right back in 2005, I got my first research material about Silke. Now, finding out about her was very different. First of all, I didn't want to go to Russia myself, to go to the archives. I don't speak or read Russian, so I did get a professional researcher in Moscow. Find me everything you can about Vorkuta Gulag, only Vorkuta Gulag. Don't know about any others. And she did. She uncovered documents, photos, testimonies, a mountain of material that's now held in our archives in Moscow. But when it came to that individual talking to people who knew her, that I was going to do. And through my friends in Slovakia that I now have, thank you, Lally, in his hometown, with these wonderful people there, I went to Košice, where Silke had lived for decades, and found friends and neighbours who said, "Yes, we'll talk to her." And so I found myself flying in and out of Slovakia and sitting with these amazing people who had known Silke for decades, friends and neighbours.
I'm sure a lot of people will have read the book, but for those who haven't, can you just explain the difference really between the Auschwitz experience and what you came to write about Silke?
Yeah, look, one of the other reasons I've written Silke the way I have too, and I've tried not to pull any punches about what happened to her. There was only one word to describe what happened to this young girl, 16 years of age, when taken to Auschwitz. Just rolled over being 19 when she found herself in Siberia. And she was systematically raped. Don't sugarcoat it, guys. Do not fall for using those words of comfort women and spoils of war that have been bandied about for decades as we gloss over what happens to girls and women during times of conflict. I won't do that. So yes, she survived Auschwitz because she was raped by the commandant there. Well, there's actually two of them, one in particular. And because of that, the Russians, when they liberated the camp, well, they accused her of sleeping with the enemy, or the actual words were prostituting herself to the enemy. And for that, got sent to Siberian Gulag for 15 years. She was there for 10 years, so she did get released, yeah, really 5 years early, so to speak. And of course, there, the treatment of her is equally as brutal.
It is an extraordinary story because you bring out the fact that even in those terrible situations, she was always looking out for other people. You've already said she saved Lally's life, or that's what he told you. She saved his life. She saved other people's lives, and yet she was being brutalized the whole time.
Yeah.
So, is there anything about her story? I know that with Lally's story, you had to fill in the gaps occasionally because there were things that he didn't know, or you didn't know about him, that he maybe misremembered, which sometimes people do. Did you have to do that with Silke at all?
Well, yes, what I had to do, particularly with her time in the Gulag, well, I found out lots of bits, because those people in Slovakia, her friends and neighbours, she seemed to have shared little bits of her life with them all. It was quite lovely sitting in one day in an apartment of her neighbour, this elderly couple, well into their 90s, but all these other neighbours had come down from the apartment block. In Slovakia, you get given an apartment and you're there for life virtually. And so these people are all sitting in the room and they're all sharing information because they're there to talk to me and the two translators I had. It was hilarious because they're all speaking Slovakian. I'm hearing, I can only speak English. My poor translators are trying to keep up with the conversations going. And these people were still hearing things that they didn't know about Silke because, well, she told me this, well, she told me that. That was quite lovely. But yeah, having to hear it that way, of course, I never had, and she was never going to reveal the true nature of how badly brutalized she was. But here's the thing, other women who had been in that camp, they did share what went on there. They made testimonies. Just like Holocaust survivors make testimonies, so too had many, many women who had been in Vorkuta. And from their testimonies, look, it wasn't hard. It was incredibly painful, but it wasn't hard to be able to draw this and connect the dots between what they had endured and what Silke would have endured, particularly once I married it up with the bits that her friends and neighbours knew.
Do you ever get asked why you wrote Lally's story and Silke's story as fiction, as novels, rather than as biographies?
Yeah, absolutely. There are constraints on writing memoirs and biographies that you don't have with the fiction, historical fiction. And remember that Lally's story had been written as a screenplay. So what's the screenplay got? It's got full of dialogue. And he had read many drafts of the screenplay, okay? So he signed off on his story. In fact, there are parts of his story that he wanted in there that are not there. For that very reason that you just touched on, I could not find a second piece of evidence. And what he was telling me I considered historically significant. And I couldn't get any secondary support. And so I left it out. And he was cranky about that because he wanted it to be put in. The funny thing is that since his book came out, I've been contacted by people in other countries who can confirm and have confirmed and shown me proof of storylines that you don't know about him because I didn't have that proof. But, well, I got distracted there, didn't I? But in terms of, yes, you have to, I wanted dialogue, didn't I? I needed the conversations that were so important to Lally. And in writing a memoir, and I tried it, I went to memoir school for a day, and it was a 5-day course, because after one day I knew I couldn't tell his story that way. It just wasn't going to work for me, and it wasn't going to work for him. So yes, that's why we had to come up with the historical fiction genre. And I have no regrets about that whatsoever.
I mean, it's in the sort of Hilary Mantel mould as well, where she had to fill in gaps.
Oh, yes, bless her. Yes, thank you, Hilary. You paved the way for people like me.
So you've got these two amazing characters, and I know you've been all over the world really, telling their stories and spreading these stories. Tell us about the time. I can't remember where you were, but I know that you wrote in your recent book that you were somewhere and you had a phone call, and instead of going home to your lovely family, you suddenly upped and went straight to Israel to meet somebody who was determined to tell you their story.
Oh, yes, I was in South Africa at this lovely little wine region, and got back to my hotel room until early hours of the morning, and I'm not tired yet, I'll read some emails. And it was an email, and from that email written to me by a man who, well, he lives in Canada, and he wrote saying that he picked up the tattooist of Auschwitz at Toronto airport on his way to Tel Aviv to visit his aging mother. And at her house the next day, he brought the book out to finish reading and put it on her coffee table. Now, the book in Canada has the same cover as Australia, and it's actually that one behind me. See the black cover with the two arms. And those two arms have got the tattooed numbers of Lali and Gita. Well, this man's mother walked past, looked at the cover, and just said to him, "That must be about Lali and Gita." Her number is 3 apart from Gita's. Her sister Sibby's is 2 apart. Few emails. By the time I got to Cape Town, I'm now talking on the phone to this 93-year-old lady. And by the time I got to Johannesburg a couple of days later, and I got in touch with my publishers, and I said, "This lady has got a story I want to hear, and I'm going to arrange to go there. And I'll go home, and then I'll get over to Israel." And I was told, "No, don't bother going home. We just reroute yourself, and we're going to Israel." So when I said, "But I can't, I've got no clean knickers," well, it didn't matter. I was told that, well, wash them or buy some more. So yes, from South Africa to Tel Aviv, and I've subsequently been back again earlier this year before we all got shut down, and spent time with these now 94 and 96-year-old ladies. 2 of the 3 sisters are still alive.
And I know you tantalizingly tell us that they're going to be another story, another book.
Yes, they are.
Now, there's a question from someone who is saying, when you write historical fiction from true life stories, how do you decide how to manage and balance telling the true story and what to change and to add to?
Look, good question. I don't often change anything. What I do is add to. If I've got a known fact about somebody, like Lali and Silka, or the other characters, the sub-characters, Gita, Dana, Schwarzhuber, even the baddie, then I try and stay true to what I know about them. It's more about adding to try and, look, you're taking dramatic license, I accept that, but sometimes to be able to get others' subplots and players' lives into the story, because it's going to pick up with your characters, you more create things. Now, I didn't create hardly anything in Lali's, and here's the difference. Only one time that I bend the truth in his story, and that's the little vignette of when the Allied planes flew over Birkenau, and all the prisoners, and look, I've heard this from many, many others, we all ran out saying, "Drop the bombs, drop the bombs." Everybody in that camp that day would have gladly died by being bombed by the Allies, if it meant taking out those gas chambers as well and destroying that place. Now, Lali and Gita were not together. I took poetic license, and in that instance, I put them together. But that was the only time.
So you took an actual incident and put your characters into that incident?
Well, they were both there. They just weren't together.
Right, right.
Together.
Is it frustrating for you that you are hearing now stories that corroborate things that Lali told you that you didn't include? Is it frustrating that they're not now in the book?
Yes and no, because that just means that when you get to watch the miniseries, you are going to learn new parts to Lali's life. And so maybe that will make it even more tantalizing to know that there are parts to his time there that have now been proven, because we have got the proof. And you'll learn more, so that's a good thing.
So we should move on to the new book, which is very different from the others. It is lots of small stories, all of them inspirational stories that you've been given, as you say, that people have come and told you. Do you want to talk us a little bit about how those stories came about and some of the things you've included?
And can I tell you, I've probably included one of the stories that have come to me, and I'm talking about the amazing emails that people started writing to me after they read Lully's story in particular, and then Silk has followed on. Look, they just don't write to me and say, thank you for writing this. I really learned something and enjoyed it. In fact, enjoy is not a word you often use in describing how you feel about the stories. They were sharing parts of their life with me, and generally something that was very, very dark. And feeling that kind of vulnerability and freedom to be able to write to me had me thinking, this is incredible. And I write back and would start conversations, and it became this whole thing that I found I wasn't just reading their words. I was picturing them. I was listening to their words. I was seeing them and find in my own head, working out where they were when they were writing to me and what their life was like. And just from that, it occurred to me, and I was with my publisher, and we were in Slovakia doing the research for Silka one night, and that was when we'd spent this time sitting in this room talking to others. And that evening we were at dinner, and we were just sort of having a drink in the bar of the hotel, and she commented that it was just amazing how people just absolutely opened up when I just sat there listening. And here's the thing, guys, that if you shut up and listen, other people will talk. And it just kind of occurred to her. She said to me, have you always listened like that? And I didn't think I was listening any way different to what I always did. And I went, oh yeah, ever since my great-grandfather told me as a girl that the sound of silence is actually quite wonderful. And that if you listen to somebody, you really listen to them, that's when they will tell you things. Not things so that you can go away and gossip, but just things to enrich your life. So the whole notion of writing a book about listening was born.
So this is a gift that your grandfather gave to you, is that right?
Well, my great-grandfather, actually. Yes, but you know, as a kid, you don't realize it. I kind of did, and here's the thing, because I've been writing about my family a little bit in this, you're not going to learn too much about me, but just a little bit, guys. It's not a memoir up front. But I have 3 of my remaining 4 siblings, sent them bits that I was writing about the family, and they're all boys. I had 4 brothers, and all the other 3 boys have written to me saying, we were so jealous of the relationship you had with Gramps. It wasn't fair that he made you special and not us. And here are these men now in their 40s, 50s and 60s complaining about our childhood, because it was just something really between him and I. And it was pretty much because I was the only girl in the family and was on the outer, shall we say.
And was that unusual in your family, or did the rest of the family not really listen to you as you were the only girl?
Well, I didn't listen to anybody. Kids were to be seen and not heard, weren't we? I think it's sort of really crazy, and I was a victim of it, and I'm now watching my daughter do similar things, so I'm pulling her up. That we spend the first 3 years of lives saying, come on, walk to me, and come on, talk, mama, dad, and we're trying to encourage these little beings to walk and to talk. And then after that, it's, oh, for goodness sake, stop running in the house. For goodness sake, stop jabbering on. And gosh, my to be 4 on Saturday granddaughter is a classic, doesn't shut up. I see her mother rolling her eyes, and if I'm in the room, she'll look at me and say, I know, Mum, I've got to listen to her. Yeah, so I wasn't listened to. I never felt I was as a child, absolutely not, because nobody told me anything anyway.
Going back, this is another question, going back to the fiction biography debate, do you get annoyed when people pick you up on things that you have perhaps put in yourself, or which they think are wrong in your books? I mean, do people say to you, but this can't be right? Or
I don't really get annoyed anymore. I was always expecting that there were going to be people who would disagree with my approach and would say that some of the things I was writing about were inaccurate, were created and made up. And when I was writing Lali's story and being challenged by that, oh, how am I going to deal with this? My first book, guys, and I never quite knew the rules. And thankfully I had these amazing publishers who decided, just go for it, girl. I finally woke up one morning and I went, sod it, what does it matter? I am not telling the story of the Holocaust. You know, academics and historians have told the story of the Holocaust for decades, and thank them. We need them to continue. I'm telling a story, Lali's story. And so, yeah, in some ways that really emboldens me to say, this is the memory of 87-year-old Lali Sokolov. Now, it's wonderful when history and memory do walk side by side and everything matches up. But when they pull apart, and they don't, I'm sorry, I'm going to go with the memory of Lali. And I was absolutely delighted one evening, I was giving a talk in a synagogue up in Sydney, and the rabbi said to the congregation before I started, he reminded them that in Hebrew, there is no word for history. He said, all our stories must come from the memory of those who lived them. And I went, you're right. Stories down the ages. It's like you put two people in a room and tell them to draw a picture of an elephant. They're both going to be different because we're individuals and we see and we hear and we interpret things differently. Every survivor I met said the same thing. Yeah, that's Lali. That's what Lali saw. It's not what I saw. I saw this. I've met other couples who met in Birkenau. Yeah, he was different to me. And they were really lovely in terms of, no, it's Lali's story, it's fine.
Well, you presumably had to make up more of Gita's story because Lali would not have known some of the things that happened to her. Where did you get her story from?
Well, from two sources. A, she made a 2-hour video show tape, of which Lali gave me to watch. So I did get it from Gita. But the character Dana in the book, that character's name is actually Lottie. Now, Lottie will be 97 next month. She lives in Sydney. She's still alive. And so from Lali introducing me to Lottie and spending time with her in Sydney, and oh gosh, I can't get up there to see her right now. I'm kind of banned from leaving 5 kilometres from my home. But so I did get her story, both from Gita and also from Lottie, who was there and knew her in the camp.
And that will have fed into the Silker's Journey book as well, presumably. Yes, yes. And you tease us tantalizingly in your new book with all sorts of stories that are already coming to you. Eddie in Timor-Leste, for example. Do you want to say anything about him?
Oh, look, this is an amazing man. It is funny because he didn't want anyone to ever talk about him. He probably is the most, in Timor-Leste, the most instrumental man there in terms of making a difference to that small, very poor country. I have been there and spent time with him. Others have wanted to tell his story and he's always just said no, because he's a background guy. He's one of the people who make a difference by working in the background. And the different presidents and prime ministers of the Timor-Leste have all wanted to try and get him on board politically, and he'll have a better of it. And he does have the most amazing story of being a young boy running from the invasion of the Timorese. And while that's the very beginning of his story, he then lived in Australia, was educated here. But when that nation got its independence, he immediately went back to that country, and where for the last 20 years, he has been making a difference. He is idolized by the people in that country. And he has set the message that I can tell his story, and I will get back to spend time with him when I can.
Another question has come in.
Amazing, a remarkable making a difference that we don't know about.
That's absolutely true. Another question's come in. Who were your inspirations as an author? You know, who do you read? Where do you get your oomph from?
Well, we've already mentioned her name, Hilary Mantel, because through her I got permission to write the way I did, and I just adore her stories and her storytelling. here's the thing. I spend a lot of time on planes because, well, it's a long haul for me to get anywhere. I'm not going anywhere right now. And even here, in fact, the last book I finished reading was a David Baldacci. And so I do like those sort of crime police procedural books. And yeah, they're my read to escape, and many of them. But yes, look, I actually do like memoirs myself too. And I've just read the most amazing one that just, you don't even know about it yet. I think it'll be released in January in your country. It's written by a journalist in London, but the person whose story it is a 100-year-old man in the States, in America. Just look out for 9 Lessons for a Remarkable Life. Okay, that's the name of the book. Now, and of course, people like Michelle Obama, and I can't wait to get hold of her husband's when it comes out. Notice I said her husband's, didn't give him his name because Michelle. And so yes, I go with those stories. Yeah, pretty much there's nothing I won't read. If somebody recommends something, I'll say, oh yeah, I'll give it a go. And I pretty much finish every book I start.
Good for you. So some people don't do that. Another question is, how much of a toll does it take on you listening to those stories?
Look, I don't think it does. Quite the opposite. I feel privileged and humbled. Anyone who can sit and listen to else telling their story, yeah, you don't, as I say, you don't get to take it on board because it's not your story. But the effect it can have on you is actually quite inspiring. And for me, that's how I feel after I've been talking to people. And when I go back to Israel and, God, Qantas, get those damn planes in the air, sitting with Livia and Magda, her sister, and being with them and hearing their stories of young girls and what they endured, yeah, you warm to them, absolutely. And look at them when they're talking to you, and you'll find that when they're remembering it, they're not always remembering it and getting upset by that memory. Quite the opposite. They're feeling empowered to now talk it out and talk about it. Here's where actually the 3 sisters are quite different to many survivors that I've met. They have told their children, now adults my age, about their life ever since they were little children. And so they have been very, very forthcoming. And yeah, their story has been part of their family story, and even now their adult grandchildren hear about it firsthand.
But you did talk earlier about having to almost offload onto someone else in the way that counsellors sometimes have to do after first hearing the stories.
Oh, absolutely. And if you've got a friend, it kind of helps if they've got maybe a qualification and they know what they're talking about, who can advise you. And I'm lucky that I do have people in my life who are professional. And here's the thing, that book of mine, and I make this right up front, this announcement, I'm actually not qualified to advise anybody on what to do, how to live their life, and I don't even try to do that. All I'm saying is, this is me, and this is my experiences, and that comes with no qualification other than that. But yes, if you do find that whatever you're hearing is upsetting and distressing, then you in turn find somebody you trust to talk to. It's called debriefing in the professional world, but we actually engage in it not knowing that's what we're doing, and we do what we call mini debriefs, which is just offload. And that's what Lali did, that's what these ladies are doing, many people do. They offload, and when it leaves them, you take it on board. Hey, you go and find somebody else to offload to, as long as you are not breaking any confidence. You can offload without necessarily breaking the confidence of the person you've been speaking to. That's important. Don't turn this into gossip.
I just want to encourage other people, if there's anyone else who has a question, to ask you, but I'm going to, just whilst that may happen, have you actually, I'm sure you, I know you have, been to Auschwitz? Tell us a little bit about how that felt, going to Auschwitz and Auschwitz-Birkenau.
You know, I never went there until after the book was published. It came out in January in 2018, and I went there for the first time in April 2018. It was important to me that I not go there until the book was at least printed, because I needed to describe that place as Lali described it to me. And I felt certain by seeing it 6 decades later, I would not be seeing what he saw. So yes, I did not go until then. And I went there with a group, an organization called March of the Living. This is when every April, young Jewish boys and girls from all around the world, thousands and thousands. The year I went there was some 17,000 students and about another 5,000 adults. And they're there to learn the story of the Holocaust, of their families that had come before them. And to be part of that was just overwhelming. And I went to Birkenau first. That was the group I went with. And walking through those gates, I just kind of went numb. It just struck me as soon as I saw those big gates and drove through them. But as I walked down that long railway line that leads you from the front to the back of Birkenau, I knew that if I looked to the left, I'd see the women's camp, and over on the right, that's where the men's camp. Now, Lully's camp or block was just down here a little bit. Now, the Gypsy Camp should be just a little bit further. And even though I had a guide there talking and telling us what we were seeing, I wasn't listening to him. I was listening to Lully in my head. And I knew.
Walking in his footsteps, weren't you, really?
Yeah. Numbing. I was watching all these young boys and girls around me. They're 16, 17, 18. And they're obviously emotionally distraught. Who couldn't be? I kind of stood away from them at times for the most part, because it was almost like you need to be there and be yourself and don't get caught up in other people's grief. Just be in your own space. As you can't comprehend it. You can't. I don't even want to try. But yeah, there was a special spot there, and I actually haven't written about it, and I don't talk about it much. But here's the thing: about 3 months before Lully died, one day I went to see him, and he was upset about something. And finally, he said to me, "I want to go back to Auschwitz." Now, here was now a nearly 90-year-old man who had not left Australia since the day he arrived here in 1947. And here he was asking me, take me back to Auschwitz. And wow, that was a sort of pick yourself up the floor sort of moment. And we talked about it, and he only ever wanted to go back there on the 20th and be there on the 27th of January. And in my head, I'm going, you don't want to go back in summer? I know it's really cold in Poland in January. But no. And so we were actually making plans, and that was in August 2006, to go back that January. And he died in the October, a few months later, so we didn't get to go there. But when I said to him that night, well, you have to tell me why. Is there one reason in particular you want to go back? What is it about that place? Because Lully did not know that his parents both perished there. I found out that fact after he died. So I knew that wasn't it. Well, I didn't know it myself at the time either. And he looked at me and he went, did you know there's a concrete step leading into Crematoria 3? And I said, no, I don't know that. And he said, it might still be there. And I went, okay. And he said, I need to go back and stand on that step. He said, that was the crematoria I entered and walked back out of. And I need to say to the 1.5 million people who died there, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't save you and I lived. Wow. You look, I'm getting chills because I'm remembering him saying it to me. Yeah, look, all I could do was hug him and say, no, you don't have to say you're sorry. But he felt he did, and I couldn't change his mind.
That comes up quite a lot in the book, how often he apologizes, you know, or you've said how often he apologized because he was one of the lucky ones, if you like. Now, there are questions coming in. You said you hadn't had any education about the Holocaust as a young girl. Is it still the case that the Holocaust isn't part of the Australian education? Is that something you feel should change?
Yeah, just by the way, what we're talking about here is survivor guilt. And every person I met who survived had it to, well, a lesser or a larger degree. Yes, I had no education about it whatsoever. I know that I had read Anne Frank's diary, but I'm pretty sure that I read that of my own volition because I was an avid reader as a kid. That's how I escaped. But I'm pleased to say that Holocaust studies, and this is New Zealand, by the way. I don't know what they teach in New Zealand now about it. I should check. But here in Australia, I'm really, really proud to say that my 3 children who went through the education system here, they all had Holocaust studies. In fact, all 3 of them, living in Melbourne, where we have a very large Holocaust museum, were taken there in school and did have that education to that degree. And here's the thing that I'm most proud of, that his story, Lali's story, has been turned into what's called a young adult version here in Australia and in the UK. And it's now in the curriculum of many, many schools in Australia. And a lot of my time is now spent doing Zoom interviews now, not in person, into schools. And I can do 2 to 3 a day sometimes, now talking to these young students who have read the book, and just help expand on, well, hey, I don't talk about the book and the story. I get to talk to them now about the extra bits, like I'm talking to you.
Another question, have you had people start to tell you things that you feel you shouldn't know, or that you need to refer to the police or professional counsellors or any of that sort of thing?
No, not really. Oh no, that's not quite true, actually. Yes, and it nearly got out of hand. Yes, you do. I did engage with somebody. It wasn't in person. It did end up in person, which was tricky. But someone who was writing, telling me things that, they did require police intervention. And I had engaged with this person for 2 or 3 emails before because the more you write back, or the more you get told, and then all of a sudden you go, oh dear, hang on a minute, no. Yes, so only really the once, and it then had the potential to, was that the person lived in the same city as I do, and of course was able to find me.
We're getting near the end of our time, which is very sad. I just have one thing I wanted to ask you about facts that you've subsequently discovered were not true. So, for example, people who had been described as having died in the Holocaust, who didn't die in the Holocaust. That's an interesting avenue, because we hear about, and we know that there were 6 million people and over 1 million from Auschwitz alone. But I just wonder if you want to say anything about finding people who are living who were thought to have died.
Absolutely, and Silke is a point here. Every archive and database of the Holocaust, be it Yad Vashem in Israel to the United States Holocaust database, we can find Silke's name. She's on them. And every one of them have those 3 words after her name, murdered in Auschwitz. And so, yes, when you find out that, and you know that she wasn't, you are faced with that whole issue of, hang on, am I really going to potentially be in more trouble here? Because I'm saying that she didn't. All the databases say she did. But by research and by digging deep and being in Slovakia, we were able to prove that she didn't. And that was an amazing discovery when Margaret, my publisher, and I sat in this bureaucrat's office being shown her birth registration in the small town of Sabanov. And there was Silke's name and her mum and her dad and her grandparents, and all beautifully written in this big journal. And there at the end, in another pen and in a different hand, we saw something else written. And when we asked the translators, what does that say? And they read out that on this day, because it was written in 1958, Cecilia Klein visited this office, bringing with her the correct documents from the government in Bratislava, declaring her to be a citizen of the state of Czechoslovakia. And so our girl, our Silke, had gone back to this town. She was born there, by the way. She never really grew up there, but she made the effort to go back to this town and have her birth registration altered. So look, the databases in those places, they're very grateful. I mean, they don't want to say, we've got it right, you've got it wrong. That's not the way it goes.
There's just a minute or two for you to tell us about your visit to Yad Vashem, which you might want to explain what that is.
Yeah, well, initially I never thought I'd get there, but when you find yourself in Tel Aviv and in Israel, And the family of Livia said to me, you know, while you're here, you really should go to Jerusalem. And I live in Australia. This is a huge place. If somebody said to me, and I'm in Melbourne, listen, you really should go to Sydney or to Brisbane, I'll go, yeah, next time when I can. And I went, oh, yes, I don't have time on this trip. I was only there for a week. And they kind of looked at me, why not? Why don't you go there tomorrow? Well, you know, because it's too far. It's 40 minutes up the road. So they made me take a day off. And yes, I went to Jerusalem. And I spent about 5 hours at Yad Vashem. It was this amazing, probably the biggest and the most significant, let's call it for what it is, the most significant Holocaust museum in the world. And I spoke to people there in their archives and their research area. They were wonderful. They let me come in once they knew who I was. They sold my book in their bookshop there, which is pretty damn humbling, I've got to tell you. And at that point, it was like they only had the English version. They've now got the Hebrew version as well. Oh, wow. That is a place that you really, folks, if you get the chance, go there. Not because you need to learn anything more. You will. But just to experience. It's kind of like also being at Auschwitz and Birkenau, that you totally internalize being there in the old, you know, once seen, never forgotten. Yeah, and there's something there. There's well, it's a bus. It's a white bus there, and that's very significant to me. A white bus. There's one there, and there's one in a museum in Sweden, because there's another story.
You're very good at tantalizing us and sort of telling us what's going to come. I can't recommend your books highly enough. I think particularly in the current climate, to have a book about hope, to have books about love and goodness that overcome one of the most horrendous events in our history is just life affirming. And I think we're all very grateful to you for giving us those stories, and may more and more of them come to you, and then therefore to us.
Yeah, thank you. And here's the thing, folks, every one of us thinks that we're special. I've just had an ordinary life. Well, you are special. Everybody is, and everybody's had a remarkable life. We often just don't know it. And to be able to give somebody the opportunity to talk about, even if it's a small incident in their life, which is significant to them, is something that if you know somebody who wants to talk, just listen to them, give them that opportunity. Because we may be ordinary, but wow, we're always living in extraordinary times.
And your book gives us so many hints and pointers as to how we can all be better at it. So I just want to thank you again very, very much for joining us at this ridiculous time in the morning for you.
Well, the sun's up here now, so there you go. A new day has begun.
Very good.
Yes, could I add my thanks, Heather, and to Fiona.
It's been a joy.
So it's been an absolute privilege, and thank you so much for taking the time out, Heather, and getting up at that ghastly hour.
I'm going back.
Okay, and just to let everybody know, we do have actual signed copies, not even plated, actual signed copies.
Guys, get yourselves down there to Chorleywood Bookshop. And I did sign those. If you're saying, oh, somebody else has done it, what the publishers did was we printed that page in advance. They shipped thousands of those pages to me here in Australia. I signed them all. I did sign them. And then I shipped that page back, and it was what they call tipped into the book when it went through the printing press.
Yeah, brilliant. And we're so delighted we've got that for this very, very special book. So thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Have a good evening.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.